Our orientation today is practical. We want to know from our scholars what's going on and what data can tell us so that we can inform our actions, but action is the goal. If we leave here today and all we think is woe is us, then we failed, and I failed. On the other hand, if each of us leaves with a kind of personal and ministerial agenda, then we will have succeeded wildly. And so that's what we're aiming for. Now what I want to do is give the bios for each of our speakers before turning it over to the first one and then just getting rolling. It's quite an impressive group. So JP de Gance is the founder and president of Communio and the co-author of the book Endgame, the church's strategic move to save faith and family in America. JP is also the author of the nationwide study on faith and relationships. Communio is a ministry originally incubated as the Culture of Freedom Initiative at the Philanthropy Roundtable, where he served as the organization's executive vice president. The initiative raised and spent $20 million over 3 years in 3 different states, seeking to identify the most effective strategies to boost marital health, family stability, and church engagement. From 2016 to 2018, the experimental initiative worked with an ecumenical network of churches and drove down the divorce rate by 24% in Jacksonville, Florida. Today, Communio serves churches across the United States, helping them evangelize by applying learnings from their successful intervention in Jacksonville. A husband and father, JP lives in Virginia with his wife and 8 children. Professor Mark Regnerus is professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin and president of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. He's the author of 4 books from Oxford University Press and more than 40 articles in peer-reviewed journals. His research and scholarly essays have appeared in media outlets such as Slate, First Things, and Public Discourse. He and his wife, Deanne, have 3 children. Brad Wilcox is professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, the Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The author of Get Married, Why Americans Should Defy Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Wilcox studies marriage, fatherhood, and the impact of strong and stable families on men, women, and children. Professor Wilcox is the author and co-author of 6 books and has written for scientific journals such as the American Sociological Review and the Journal of Marriage and Family, as well as popular outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and National Review. Kathy Garcia Prats has been married for 50 years and is the proud mother of 10 sons, ranging in ages from 30 to 48. She and her husband are the authors of Good Families Don't Just Happen, What We Learned from Raising Our 10 Sons and How It Can Work for You, Good Marriages Don't Just Happen, and What to Do When Your Baby is Premature. Kathy authored Good Sons Don't Just Happen, Insights on Raising Boys from the Mother of 10 Sons, which I just received and can't wait to read because we have 3 boys. The book was a recipient of the Mom's Choice Award. In 1998, the Garcia Prats family was honored as Houston Family of the Year by Family Services of Greater Houston at their annual Celebration of Families luncheon. Kathy and Joe were the 2009 recipients of the Standard of Christ Award presented by the Jesuit Volunteer Corps South at their annual dinner. And in 2020, the University of St. Thomas Nesti Center for Faith and Culture, that's us, honored Joe and Kathy and the family with the Faithful Citizenship Award at our 10th annual Faithful Citizenship celebration. So those are our speakers today. They're quite impressive. And so I'm going to get out of the way and hand it over first to JP de Gance. Let's take it away, JP.
Hey, thank you so much, Kevin. And, this is a great opportunity to speak in a disembodied way to all of you. And the giant risk for all of you is that I can't read the room. And so I don't know if I'm putting you to sleep. So we will proceed with that in mind. Now, just by way of intro, Kevin talked a bit about this. Communio, we exist to equip the local church to share the gospel through marriage and relationship ministry. That's our purpose. We work with Trinitarian churches who hold to a biblical definition of marriage. We operate in 19 states. Last year reached almost 7 million in revenue and have staff around the country. So with that said, I want to be super clear here at the very beginning. Okay, Kevin said, The purpose here is to both help us to better understand the issue so that we can take action. So when I talk with pastors, bishops, different groups of Protestant and Catholic leaders, I want to be very clear. Faith in Jesus is in decline because marriage is in decline. All right. So pastorally speaking, nothing else matters unless the church reverses this trend. Okay. So I'm going to start by giving you some data that tries to prove this to you. I think this is an audience that's probably fairly sympathetic to that, but hopefully you go back to your constituencies and can share some of this. Right. So the nationwide study on faith and relationships, which Communio published last year, has this key finding. Right. It's that the collapse of resident fatherhood, which is the bad fruit of our nation's flight from marriage, that's what is fueling the growth in religious non-affiliation. It's also what's fueling the epidemic of loneliness. All right. And if you think about it, today, if you're under the age of 35, half or less than half of all young adults in that age group had continuously married parents through childhood, right? And if family structure had no impact on faith practice, you would expect when you look out in the pews of any given church that those sitting in the pews would reflect that same family structure. And the reality is we do not see that, right? Communio's study is based on when we work with the church, we deploy a survey early on. And we've completed about 70,000 of these in-pew surveys on Sunday mornings. The study is based on a snapshot of 19,000 over a prior 6-month period across 113 different churches in 12 different states, evangelical, Protestant, Catholic churches. What we found is 80% of everybody sitting in the pews on Sunday grew up in a home with continuously married parents. And that trend held regardless of age, okay? And so if you look on this slide, obviously what I really want you to do is look at all of the very small numbers and text. Just kidding. I just want you to look at the general homogeneity between these bar graphs. The blue, men, red, women, okay? The darker blue is men who are never married, and then the lighter color in each is those who are married currently in that demographic. It goes from 18 to 29 from your left to 50 to 59 on your right, okay? And the percentages are the percentage of people in each group who grew up in a home with continuously married parents, okay? And what you're seeing is that if you were born in say the year 2000, or you're a single man, or you were born in the year 1964 and you are a married man, okay, you are just as likely to have grown up with a continuously married parent. In fact, 81% of your peers in that group grew up in that way. And what's changed since 1964, as everyone in this room knows, is family structure changed, okay? And that family structure change ultimately preceded the change in our country's faith practice. In fact, churchgoers are far more likely to have resident fathers as a consequence of this. And if this is true, you'd expect to see this validated in other data. Indeed, you do. Okay, the slide that I'll share with you here, the dark blue are those non-marital births by year. Okay, the teal is ever divorced women by year. And both those are obviously proxies for family breakdown or reduction in people growing up in intact families. And so then you don't start to see religious non-affiliation grow and really mirror that growth on a slope until about 25 years after the growth in those family disintegration trends. Okay, and so it's my case that as the fruit of the sexual revolution grows, the adults grown in homes where mom and dad don't stay continuously married, they start to show up in religious non-affiliation data. It's why overwhelmingly churchgoers are more likely to have married parents. Married fathers fundamentally are the missing ingredient, okay? And there's a couple different studies that I'll bring to you here briefly to double click on it. Oxford University Press published a longitudinal study covering about 350 families, trying to understand when religious transmission successfully occurs from parent to child. One thing that I'll pull out from this book-length study is that it looks at the quality of parental relationships. And what they found was, not knowing whether or not, regardless of the frequency of familial practice of faith, what they found was an adult reporting to have a warm or close relationship with dad was 25 percentage points more likely to have the same faith as his parents. Okay, and a child who reported a warm or close relationship with mom, there was no statistical relationship in increased likelihood of faith practice. So dad is a huge factor. And so as marriage goes down, marriage is a proxy for fatherhood. And Dr. Paul Vitz, who's become a friend, he's a former atheist, a professor emeritus at NYU, one of the co-founders of Divine Mercy University, has a peer-reviewed thesis that goes into the psychological why that this happens. Okay, he's written a popularly adapted book on those studies called Faith of the Fatherless, and he does it in a psychoanalysis of the world's 30 best-known atheists. Okay, and what he found is that they all have this big thing in common, whether it's Karl Marx or Madeleine Marie O'Hare. Okay, they have this absent father or a deep resentment to their father. In the case of Madeleine, she fantasized about actually murdering her father, and had written it as much. Okay, so a failure to attach to a dad is a big deal, and you see this. Paul brought this up to me. He figured this out after the book was written. Sam Harris, one of the best known new atheists, right? Very logical. His entire reason for being an atheist is logical. Well, it appears that this same factor is going on there. He writes about the abandonment of his father, sadly at the age of 2, and his father disappearing in his life. So what this means is it's really hard to grasp that there is a heavenly Father who loves us, and so loves us that he gave his only son to die for us. It's hard to believe that if I resent, hate, or even lack an earthly father. That's the thing. Now, this isn't determinative. I always like to make this point. It's not determinative, right? 1 out of 5 people in the pews on Sunday came from a family that it was not intact, okay? But what we talk about is this is a highly important social factor. If you're trying to understand the societal-wide reduction in faith practice, there's no better explanation than the societal-wide drop in marriage and drop in fatherhood. Okay, so renewal of faith fundamentally requires Christian marriage. And but if we do it, if we succeed there, it's going to unleash a whole lot of other great things, right? It'll, for instance, solve the loneliness epidemic. Okay, and the Surgeon General came out with his advisory, 82-page advisory, and I think he just buried the lead. Page 15, he uses the word marriage for the first time, and he only uses the word marriage twice in 82 pages, right? And the reality is if we had rates of marriage, even with all of our smartphones, okay, if we had rates of marriage like early 2000s or late 90s levels, you wouldn't have an epidemic of loneliness, okay? We look at churchgoers, okay, and compare them to what the Surgeon General said. The Surgeon General said about half of all Americans in his advisory were lonely, about 22% of all churchgoers. When you peel that back, vast difference between single and married churchgoers. So of the singles, about half of single churchgoers are considered lonely. And the loneliest group of churchgoers are not the widows and the elderly. It is the loneliest group of widows are those between the age of 30 and 39 who are divorced and never married. Okay, they are overwhelmingly more lonely than the loneliest cohort of widows, which, by the way, based on our survey, the loneliest group of widows are widows between the age of 50 and 59. Okay, and so there's for churches, sometimes you think we're doing fine in church, and churchgoers are actually better off. And I'm going through Brad Wilcox's book now. It's a fabulous book. I'm excited about what he'll share with us in a little bit. Churchgoers have healthier marriages on the behavior of getting to church and being in a church community. But there's still a lot of need and opportunity within the church. 1 in 5 Sunday churchgoers self-report struggling in their marriage, right? And women in church are 62% more likely to struggle in their marriage than their husbands, which I think doesn't surprise any of the women in the audience. Guys were a little bit, I think, slower on the uptake of realizing what's going on. And in fact, the biggest gap in marital satisfaction between men and women are married women in church in their 30s are 109% more likely to report struggling in their marriage than their husbands. Anybody who does counseling for couples is familiar with divorce, you know that 70% of divorce filings are initiated, or at least 70% of the divorces are initiated by women. Okay, so this shouldn't surprise us. But for those of us who are concerned about equity, don't worry. By the time they get into their 40s, both people are actually more likely to struggle in their marriage. So that gap goes down, creating more equity there. So we got that going for us. Now, if you're interested in getting any more of this data, I would absolutely encourage you to download the study for free. You can download communio.org/study. Got reams of this for you. I would encourage you, as a call to action, share it with pastors, share it with small groups, share it with anybody that you know who's active and interested in sharing the gospel, because this is a huge stumbling block. But Kevin asked me for this to also have a focus on action. So I want to share. This is a huge, we don't just study this issue because we want to understand it. At Communio, we equip the local church. We're principally a ministry who takes action in these areas to share the gospel through marriage and relationship ministry. Consider this: on the Catholic side, 82% of all Catholic parishes in America spend $0 on relationship and marriage ministry, and 85% of all churches total, Protestant and Catholic, spend nothing on marriage and relationship ministry. Fundamentally, life changes person to person. Life changes most effectively not through the regional church or the diocesan church, but through the local church. Okay, and where it's absent there's a huge opportunity for us. I share that number as an optimist. There's a great opportunity for the church to take action. It's a little bit like having your team blown out at halftime and realizing that you never got on the field in the first half. We're just not engaged yet in this area. As Kevin said, our work started as a test case in Jacksonville, sixth worst city in America for marriage, prior to the work in the county, and worked with more than 50 churches, Catholic, Baptist, different denominations of churches, pioneering a data-informed approach to marriage ministry in and through the local church. Over that span, 58,912 people went through 4-hour or longer relationship ministry. We saturated the area with digital marketing, targeting couples at risk for divorce and drawing them in to a relationship ministry in the parish. The net was the divorce rate dropped 24% over that 3-year span. We had some scholars take a look at it to try to understand if we had any effect on that. There's a guy here from UVA who's one of those scholars, took a look at it and concluded there's no other way demographically to explain that decline other than our intervention, which is about all that could be said from a scholarly perspective. So this was also good for churches. Okay, what we realized is when the church serves into a felt need, and did it strategically and over time, more people come, right? We do a lot of work in Montana. There's a lot of national parks out there. They say don't feed the animals. If you feed the animals will come. And in a certain sense, I tell pastors that couples are the animals. Let's feed them so they come and grow in health and holiness in and through the local church. Okay, and so this is the form of what we do. The matter looks different church to church, or the strategic framework, if you want to call it. We say the data-informed full circle relationship ministry, using data to diagnose what's happening in the local church, and applying best practices for every stage of relationship, from the most remote stage of single life and remote preparation for marriage to those in marital crisis. And it's animated through the right side of that ministry engagement ladder, 4 steps of ministry engagement in and through the local church. And when we work with a church, every church we work with, it's a 3-year partnership. Okay, so every individual church has a church strategist who works with them through this 4 steps. Analyze. We help them collect data to know what's happening in their church through surveys and modeling. And then we unpack for the lead pastor and his team, interpret that data, set 2 clear goals. One is a breadth goal, grow Sunday attendance from X to Y over 3 years, and then a depth goal, which is let's move grown adults through relationship skills ministry in the local church and have a target number for that. And then we work with them to create a written plan to informed by the latter to execute it. And then we support that local church over 3 years with ongoing training and support, regular meetings to make sure they're executing it and executing it well. In fact, we're supporting 2 churches locally in Houston at this time. And then review. We help the local church gather data to know what's working and what's not working, to stop things that aren't working and increase things that are working. Sometimes pastors and church leaders get a little uncomfortable with our focus on data. I like to point out that somebody counted that there were 3,000 people baptized that day in Acts 2. And so I do think that the Holy Spirit cares about numbers, and you should too. So with that said, this is what it looks like on a timeline. We want to get them here and help them grow. 3 outreach events a year, 90% fun, 10% enrichment, moving into ongoing engagement, 70-30, more fun, less fun, more enrichment, and then ultimately into the programmatic growth journey. Communio does not author any specific growth journey content. That's an 8-hour or more program. We recommend other. We realized that was not the gap that needed to be solved. The great challenge is that amazing life-changing resources are not getting to the people who most frequently need it at the scale that we need in order to save the church and the country, right? And then we work on behalf of the local church as a world-class marketing agency, as a nonprofit ministry. Okay, so everything that somebody who's running for local office or statewide office can do, we do from a marketing and outreach perspective for the local church. So when we work with the local church, we can help that church identify, for instance, couples in the community with young kids under the age of 10, women who are very likely to be pregnant. I do not recommend that you guess this in general, but in terms of marketing, you can identify folks where there's very likely to be a pregnancy, and then other risk areas, and then being able to run Facebook marketing or Instagram, YouTube, targeting folks, email marketing. We have about 40% of the country's email addresses. Mobile block walking. I used to go door to door for my wife and I, for our church. Super painful. This changes it because you're able to go just to the houses where you can make a personal invitation that is relevant to the people sitting in the house, right? And then direct mail, as well as person-to-person texting. Really, all the different features that we know about our political process, which is way less important than marriage and the family, of course. So then we take all of that that marketing know-how, and we marry it to a deep knowledge of relationship ministry. And yes, that was an intentional pun. We own our puns, and the reality is that marketing know-how exists for a purpose. The purpose is to equip the local church to save marriage and the family. We want to take a John the Baptist approach, which is we want to decrease and we want the local church to increase and focus on this highly leveraged area of sharing the gospel through the renewal of marriage and the family. So I'll pause there and thank you. Thank you for listening. Hopefully that all came through okay. I don't know if everyone's all asleep or not, Kevin, but I'll hand it back to you.
Our next speaker is Professor Mark Regnerus.
It's good to be with you today. It's good to see Kevin again. Haven't seen him in a while. We enjoyed him at the Austin Institute for years, 5, 6, 7. Put us on good standing, and then came to Houston, and it's just been great to see you again, and how well things are going here at St. Thomas. Anyways, great to have you as an audience today. Talk about a book that came out in 2020. I've given a variety of talks about it, not recently though. So, one of the ladies I was sitting at with said she just finished reading the book. And I thought, well, maybe you should get up and give this, because I think it's more current in your mind than mine. But So I want to tell you a little bit about the background of this book and a handful of the punchlines, all in whatever 18 minutes. So it was a data collection project, not survey data, which is what I usually do, but in-person interviews, qualitative data analysis. We did it in 7 different countries: Mexico, United States, Spain, Poland, Russia, Lebanon, Nigeria, back in 2017-ish, back when we could go to some of those places. And one of the biggest driving questions of it was to understand the marital impulse today. Mostly with the focus of talking to people who weren't married, or if they were married, has been married within the last 3 or 4 years. And so, and a focus of people between roughly 22 to upper 30s. And so in that process, we asked them a variety of questions, but one of the things we asked them, which was almost universally answered in a particular direction, is, has anything about marriage changed today? Okay. Has anything about marriage changed today? And everybody, except for maybe 4, said, yeah, it has. It's different than it was in the past. And one of the things I think is worth reflecting on that is, I actually don't think a ton has changed about the internal workings of marriage. But when they get that question, I think they are understanding it about like the external circumstances by which a marriage comes to be, right? Here's a slide from one of the better historical demographers in the United States. Projections of the percent of women who will never have been married by age 40 to 44 by their different birth cohorts, starting all the way back in 1825 up to roughly the present. And when I asked that question to the young people around the globe, what they told me is about the processes of getting married, how difficult it is. How can you trust somebody? How can you find somebody? How do you know they won't leave you? All of these things, which are certainly perhaps a bit more urgent today than they've been in the past, but they weren't answering the question about the internal dynamics of marriage. But what they were looking at and fearing in their head is that it's going to become tougher. And they're absolutely right. Because when my mother got married, 1967, on this scale, roughly 12 to 12.5% of women aged 40 to 44 had never married. Well, she didn't become one of those. She was married at age 22. Okay? But now you look, since the cohort born in 1935 to 1939, just pre-war, that number of women who hasn't married and a concomitant same number of men have not married has increased precipitously, such that when he begins his projections, right, roughly in the cohort that starts around my age, 1970, because he wrote this about 10, 12 years ago, he suggests and asserts that the share of women who are not going to marry, who are 20 years old now, is roughly a third, right? And I'm beginning to think that's an underestimate. Only because the dynamics around the internal angst around marriage and relationships is high. I teach a class called Romantic Relationships and Family Formation, and taught it last spring. I'm teaching it now. And one of the things we do is we put out a question fairly early in the semester for them to write their answer to. And we did it last week, and it said, what concern or fear do you have about relationships and the future? Didn't know what they'd say. Didn't do that last year as a new experiment. Get the data back, and I read through them this weekend, and I was shocked. There's 80 kids in this class, but shocked about that sort of level of angst around this subject of relationships all across the board. You know, am I going to meet somebody? I don't think I'm getting it. I've never been on a date yet in their junior, senior in college, and I'm worried that this is not going to change. I'm worried about infertility. I'm worried that I will meet and marry the wrong person and that they will leave. I'm worried that I will meet and marry the wrong person and I will leave. I'd say out of 80 students, maybe 5 had fairly tame kinds of fears that I think I would have had if I had been writing this back when I was 20 in the early 90s. So there's something real here. The circumstances around marriage have changed. I'm not sure the internal dynamics necessarily have, though. So one of the reasons those circumstances have changed is because of the shift in how people understand marriage timing, not so much how to do marriage, but marriage timing. Sociologist Andy Cherlin, writing not recently about this, picked up on this, and when I read it, I thought, this is exactly what's going on. He talks about how there's a shift in the mentality between, do you think of marriage as a foundation to the adult life course, right? Something that is sort of enables you to accomplish certain key adult goals in your life, and you're going to do it together? Or do you think of marriage as sort of something that you have to work to become like eligible for, you have to seek to achieve, and that it's going to take some time, but you have to work hard at becoming the kind of person somebody wants to marry, versus this foundational mentality, like you marry and then you become something together in life. You afford a home, a car, etc., and you have children. Whereas now the mentality is, well, first I need a house or a condo, and I need a car, I need a job, I need to finish my education, which takes longer and longer for less and less benefit. And then maybe somebody will want to marry me. It's a profound change in how we understand the thing. And it's been subtle, and it hasn't really affected how marriages operate. It just affects how people think about when they're going to do this and what does it take to get there. And it adds a significant burden to the kind of the process of marriage. And, once you're in a marriage, it's not necessarily a piece of cake either, lots of work to do, but now we've added a ton of work on the front end, right? Which I think is suboptimal certainly for young adults' psychological health, okay? And we all know that this is a profound challenge, and it wasn't just because of COVID. It was pre-COVID, we saw it. It got exacerbated during COVID, but anxiety is profound. So now this slide I talked, or this increase in the number of people who are delaying, means it's not just about waiting, it's about fewer marriages ever happening because of this delay. Some of my critics would say, oh, Mark, they're just waiting until they're more stable, mature. Like, no, the waiting means it ain't going to happen for an increasing number of people who want to marry. And that's sad. That's frustrating for me as somebody who wants to see people accomplish these things. So the capstone mentality becomes marriage as a status symbol, okay? And if you take a step back and think, okay, the social mediaization of life, you get it. It's like now marriage is an Instagram thing, right? It becomes, this occurred pre-social media, but it's been exacerbated by this. It's a status of successful development rather than just the practical thing you do, right? There were a couple other sociologists who had written about growing up in sort of marital cultures or not. And when they wrote about it, I read it in a journal, and it's like, where did they collect this data? And it happened to be the same county in rural Iowa where I spent 11 years. That was sort of the pro-marriage county that they had in their data. I'm like, absolutely, right? And then I look back, I tell my students this, I look back when I was in college, I just, I married my first serious girlfriend. Some people say, you are crazy, man, for doing that, right? Well, it's worked out so far just fine. I recognize why not everybody should do that. But also, I see myself as having been embedded in this foundational vision. It wasn't a choice. It was the air I breathed. Okay. And people marry earlier, 22. There are more marriages happening in that. The emphasis is on, well, you should do these things together rather than do them apart and then seek to become attractive to each other. That was a foreign language to me. So one of the things that is stalking, as a result, stalking young adults is this notion of uncertainty, right? And the answers I got on those sheets, there's just a ton of concern about the future, right? And so I wrote a chapter in the book on, it's called endemic, it's called uncertainty. It was supposed to be called endemic uncertainty because it's so profound and so extensive. The thing is, here, I'll go back to this in a second, but in theory, committing should diminish uncertainty, right? If you're uncertain about this person, but you think they're fundamentally decent, etc., commit, and then you're in, right? It just doesn't seem to work that way today. Uncertainty thrives on kind of fear of economic expectations, material expectations. Everybody has high expectations. We did data collection in 7 countries. There is just, everybody wants the same thing, right? There was once upon a time where parts of the world didn't necessarily want the same thing as you because there was no hope of having it. And now everybody knows what you have, right? And everybody wants it, okay? Everybody has the same vision now. The capstone vision is operative in Lebanon, Nigeria, Russia, all those places, right? So this are a handful of quotes for like what they talk about. The people that we interviewed, they don't like it this way, but they don't see a way around it, right? It's a conviction, this uncertainty that marriage is something that you have to merit, right? Again, that's capstone mentality. It's not foundational mentality. Add to that experience of parental divorce, and that just adds layers of uncertainty. Plus, the parents themselves become skeptics of marriage, and they caution their children, be careful, become independent, because you never know what's going to happen. Like, it's hard, I'd say, if you're a adult child of parents getting divorced, like, I understand why they say it, because it didn't work for them and they want to caution you because they want you to avoid the same. But it is something that fosters in kids uncertainty, which means delay. Delay means often cohabitation, finding out if this is going to work, etc., thinking that you can discern whether this is the right person by just mimicking marriage. Okay? All right. Plus, I don't talk about it here much, but the structure of smartphone dating exacerbates all of this because you have tons of options. When I met my wife at age 18, I knew there was one other girl who kind of liked me, and that's it, right? I wouldn't trade that for nothing, because today is, it's humorous, but it's a wreck. Online dating. It's not because it can't work. It can work. Some of you have met this way, but you met in spite of the hurdles, the psychological hurdles that happen when you are sliding left, right through human beings, okay, that you don't know, that you haven't met, who you're trusting an algorithm instead of trusting your parents or trusting your friends. It heightens uncertainty. Now, what can we do about it? A handful of things. I only talk about perhaps 2. Which 2 were they? Okay, good. I think we need to recover these sort of marriage-friendly subcultures, which involves in parts, number 1, telling exemplary stories about marriage. So, and since I wrote the book, I have 3 children. My oldest got married. My second oldest is engaged. And I'm like, how did that happen? Because I didn't see it coming. at all. It just happened. And one of the things I think, though, is that in our household, I write about this stuff, we talk about it at the dinner table. We were never trying to push our children into a foundational vision. We just talk about stuff. They see my wife and I argue, solve problems, etc. They got used to the warp and woof of married life. And when they came across somebody who kind of reminded them of somebody that looked like their father or looked like their mother, it just happened, right? But I'm pretty sure it just didn't happen, because there's lots of things along the way that if my wife and I had done things differently, those interactions may not have turned out the same way. It would have been hit and miss. So the subculture in your household. And I want to end on one thing that it was sort of a culturally unusual thing here in Houston. It's perhaps a bit mixed on this, is number 7, considering allowing your adult children to live at home before they get married, if only for the right reasons, not so that they can sit in your basement, play video games, and eat your food, although that can happen anyway. But when our oldest finished college, and a few of you know him, he was going to move back to Austin and he got a job. I thought, I don't want you living on your own. I want you living here. You're not done yet, right? You're not cooked. Right? There's more that has to happen. I didn't say it like that, but we encouraged him. I said, hey, you can save your money. I'm not even going to charge you rent, okay? If your conduct is good. He did it. He saved money. He was dating his eventual wife at the time. But I look back, that year that he spent at home, very formational. He was finally in the mood and period of life where he wanted to understand how his parents and the household worked. It wasn't that way at age 18. He was looking to get away. So I just think it's a prudent move. And I think we undersell it in our culture. Anyways, there's a lot more in the book, but my time is short. And so I'm going to stop there and deed it over to Mr. Wilcox, my dear friend since 1996. And frankly, arguably my most significant and first introduction to the Catholic Church. So
thank you, Mark. Keeping right on rolling, we will have Brad Wilcox up next. Let me get your...
Hey, great. Thanks, Kevin, for having us here this morning. As we get started with my talk, I want to just kind of begin with a question, and that is just to raise your hand if you would like to be happy. Okay, so obviously most folks here want to be happy. And the reason I ask that question, right, is because, you're not alone. And we even know that our civilization is a nation dedicated, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, to the, quote, pursuit of happiness. This pursuit has been and remains fundamental to the American experience. And I have to confess, I'm kind of a little bit obsessed with Jefferson. Of course, I have my problems with Jefferson, but I live kind of under the shadow of Monticello, his home in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I teach at his university that he founded, the University of Virginia. So again, this issue of the pursuit of happiness is kind of important for a number of reasons for me as a scholar and as a person. And yet, when we look at the trends in the data, what we're seeing is that American happiness is falling, okay? It's coming down, as this Gallup poll indicates. Mark and I also track something called the General Social Survey, also kind of tells the same story. Again, happiness is down in America today. And maybe it's because we're pursuing the wrong things as a culture, as men and women also. Okay, maybe we're not really kind of heading towards the things that are most important when it comes to a flourishing and mostly happy life. My own thought is part of the problem is that our ruling class message or messages around kind of what's important are off, that they're kind of steering us in the wrong direction, what I call a kind of Midas mindset. You all kind of know the King Midas story. And actually, I should acknowledge here that my wife is the person who recommended this idea of the Midas mindset to me. Of course, the thought with Midas is that what really matters is gold not love in a sense. And he gets, into some trouble with this notion. But the idea is that our elites today are often kind of stressing the importance of money, the importance of work, the importance of education, the importance of kind of building your own brand. That's sort of where the path is going to lead to prosperity and happiness for ordinary Americans. And this kind of was brought home to me one night finishing up the book project. And I was working on an edit and was getting distracted by looking on Twitter because there was a headline that was trending on Twitter from Bloomberg News. And this headline told us that, quote, women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer, okay? And it told us that foregoing marriage and parenthood is a bigger payoff for American women, okay? So the claim here empirically was, and I'll come back to this in a second, because it's false, important to note here, but the claim was that basically steering clear of marriage and motherhood for women was the sort of path to prosperity. But that wasn't the only message embedded in this Bloomberg story. The other message in this Bloomberg story, which was just told kind of in story form, was that women who were steering clear of marriage and motherhood were kind of just living their best life. That they were incredibly happy, incredibly fulfilled. Every single childless woman in this Bloomberg story was just totally living her best life, including this woman here, Ashley, who is splitting time between properties in Manhattan and the Jersey Shore, doing a lot of travel, just kind of living that that Midas mindset lifestyle. And she says in her own words, I love my life and feel very fulfilled. Okay, so clearly there was a lot of work being done here. And if you had any doubts about kind of the author's agenda, on the day that she published this piece in Bloomberg, she tweeted out some tweet where she was kind of, that figure on Twitter that has like the dancing woman in red. She's like, this is for all my female childless friends. So clearly she had an agenda here. So, okay, I'm giving you one example from Bloomberg. Is this really emblematic of anything, right? You might ask if you're more skeptical of the kind of argument that I'm making. Well, I think it's actually pretty emblematic of a lot of media messaging around marriage and motherhood. We're kind of getting a lot of anti-nuptial and anti-natal messages from me. This is the Atlantic making the case against marriage. Okay, it's pretty anti-nuptial. This is the New York Times kind of making the case for a needless divorce. The woman even acknowledges in this piece that her husband's like a good guy, that she kind of loved him, but she just wants more freedom, basically. And so she leaves him. Okay, so this is the stuff we're getting from the mainstream left. I don't think anyone here is kind of surprised to have someone like me kind of chronicling some of the problems with the mainstream progressive messaging around marriage and family. Okay. But what's interesting today is that we're now getting kind of similar messages from the online right that are also going after marriage and parenthood. But where the left is kind of focusing on women, sort of saying that for women, this is a bad deal, getting married and having kids. Who is the online right targeting with their anti-marriage message? Men, exactly. Okay, so this is kind of a new thing. We're getting hit from all sides here in our culture. And I call it the red pill right. People like Pearl Davis here on the left and Andrew Tate here on the right are telling us that marriage is a bad deal for guys. There's kind of no return on the investment for men. This is articulated in this. I'm not going to play it, but you can kind of come to this video and hear Andrew Tate kind of inveighing against marriage today from men. And he's a very kind of, in some ways persuasive and powerful speaker. And I was in Utah, of all places, just 2 weeks ago, speaking to a group of primarily, teenagers at an LDS school in Utah. And I asked them about Andrew Tate, and there were a lot of sheepish smiles from the teenage boys in this room, again, in Utah with a predominantly Mormon group. Okay, so Andrew Tate and this kind of messaging is definitely out there among a lot of our teenage boys. My own teenage son kind of acknowledged that he's very much aware of the Tate perspective, from his circles and his internet meanderings. Okay, so this is kind of what we're facing, is that basically the left and the right in some ways are certain kind of portions of the left and the right are telling us the path to prosperity and happiness run away from marriage and family, not towards them. So I think this is part and parcel of why we're seeing what I'm calling the closing of the American heart unfolding right now in our country and our culture. And what I mean by this notion of the American heart closing is that the elite messaging that we're getting, and we're also kind of seeing expressed oftentimes in social media, is helping to push Americans, young adults especially, as Mark was saying, away from marriage and family, away from kind of our most fundamental social institution that gives us kids, that gives us kin, that gives us financial stability, even more importantly, so many opportunities, not just to be cared for, but to give of ourselves, to make that gift of self, to obviously quote from St. John Paul the Great. So empirically, what is it that I'm talking about this morning? What is kind of the trends? And I'm piggybacking here on Mark. We didn't actually plan this particular piece out, but it's, you know, it's clear that the marriage rate's fallen by about 65% since 1970, the year that I was born. And I would actually, I would raise the number that Mark just shared with you to 1 in 3. Okay, so what we're projecting now is that for 20-somethings today, so for the students kind of who are at this university and their peers broadly kind of described, about 1 in 3 of them will never marry. We've never been in this demographic territory before, where so many of our young adults will end up in midlife and later life without the benefit of a spouse. And that, of course, has implications for childbearing, obviously, because even today, marriage is still a big driver of fertility, of childbearing. We're seeing the fertility rate in this country fall to about 1.6 right now. And my colleague Lyman Stone, who's a demographer, is projecting further declines for the United States in the near future. So again, these are marks of this closing of the American heart that's unfolding. And what this means practically for young adults is that at least probably 1 in 4 young adults today will never have children. And again, we've never had this kind of pattern playing out where there are going to be so many folks who don't have the experience, the struggles, the stresses, but the joys of becoming a father, of becoming a mother for our 20-somethings today. We get a kind of an inkling of sort of what this means when we look across the Pacific Ocean. And what we're seeing in places like China and Japan is what's been called kind of the bare branches phenomenon or pattern here in China, where there are lots of adults who are living without a spouse and any children, okay? And we know this is linked in Japan, for instance, where it's sort of been pioneered. I call it the land of the setting sun, not, of course, the rising sun. It's linked to economic stagnation. It's linked to a lot of public debt for Japan. But it's also linked to a profound increase in loneliness for older Japanese adults. And there was a kind of a harrowing story in the 2019 New York Times that was talking about sort of how this is playing out in Japan. And it told us that there was a generation of older Japanese women and men living in, quote, extreme isolation, often left to live and die alone in their final years. So in the words of that New York Times story, kind of talking about this dynamic unfolding, this bare branches pattern unfolding in Japan, they said this, quote, "The isolation of elderly Japanese is so common that an entire industry has emerged around it, specializing in cleaning out apartments where decomposing remains are found." So whereas these people are so isolated and alone in later life that they don't have people regularly visiting. They don't have, obviously, a spouse with them. They don't have adult children. They don't have grandkids kind of coming around. And so this is kind of like the end of the road for Japan. They've lost more than 500,000 people in terms of population last year. It just kind of gives us a sense of what happens if we can't kind of reopen the American heart, potentially. Now, of course, when you talk about these kinds of trends, as Mark and I do a good bit, there are plenty of voices in the culture who would say, well, you know what, it doesn't really matter that marriage, for instance, is in decline. I'm thinking of the NYU sociologist Eric Klinenberg, wrote a book called Going Solo. And in an interview with the New York Times, he could not muster a negative word about the falling marriage rate in America. He said, for young professionals, being single is a sign of success and a mark of distinction, a way to gain freedom and experience the anonymity that can make city life so exhilarating. Okay, so again, this is kind of how many of our elites are responding to this unfolding trend when it comes to marriage in America. But my perspective, obviously, is pretty different than Eric Klinenberg's. Because I would say that in a nation where we're seeing rising economic inequality, where too many of us are, what I would say, are addicted to electronic opiates, where many adults, particularly younger adults, are saying that they're beset by loneliness. And again, where many of us, particularly again, younger adults, are unmoored by what I would describe as a kind of rising normlessness, you know, not kind of having their lives governed by some key conventions. It's in this economic, technological, social, and normative context that I would suggest to you, it's not just that marriage and family matter for us and our kids and our young adults, they matter more than ever. This is my hypothesis, okay? In an increasingly anomic world, having the benefit of a spouse and kids to care for and then care for you when you're older becomes that much more valuable. But empirically, what's the case? Well, we're seeing, for instance, when it comes to college graduation, you've got a picture of my university here in the middle of the slide, UVA. What we're seeing is that, yes, kids who are raised as boomers in yellow bar families, intact families, were more likely to graduate from college compared to their peers in non-intact families in the blue bar. But that relationship has become even stronger for millennials. So we've got some evidence here that it's not just that marriage matters for our kids, it matters more than ever when it comes to college graduation. We see the same pattern playing out, for instance, when it comes to school suspensions for high schoolers. Okay, that the benefit of coming from an intact married family when you've got both your parents in the household is stronger now than it was 16 years ago in a different data set. We see another kind of study on sort of economic stress showing the same pattern. So again, what I'm saying is for kids, it's not just that marriage matters today, it's that it matters more than ever for their well-being. What about adults? What's the story there for men and women? Because as Mark was kind of, I think, suggesting, there are a lot of folks becoming more ambivalent or concerned about marriage. Well, financially, we're seeing the kind of the benefit financially in terms of your household income is growing relative to being unmarried for, you know, contemporary adults versus adults who are kind of coming up in the 70s when I was a kid. Okay, so again, financially, the benefits of putting a ring on it, or to quote from my book, of getting married, are bigger now than they were when I was born back in 1970. But what about this happiness thing that I began our time with this morning? Where does the happiness story kind of play out for adults today? And I mentioned this in part because when I talk to UVA students, when I talk to my colleagues at UVA, the message I get from a lot of UVA students is, I'm going to focus on my education, I'm going to focus on my work. This is part and parcel of what Mark was describing as the capstone model. And then maybe at some point I'm going to focus on getting married. But their priority is this kind of Midas mindset, this education, this work, this income orientation. And there's not kind of like a lot of thinking among at least my UVA students about how their lives could be oriented towards love and marriage in some kind of near-term way. They kind of think that the most important thing at some level is especially a good job. And they're not alone, because a lot of different Pew polls are telling us that Americans, and even parents now, unfortunately, thinking about their kids, are prioritizing education, money, and especially work as what they think are the most likely drivers of happiness, of meaning, of fulfillment, okay, as this Pew data tell us, okay? But what does the social science research or data tell us about what is most likely to drive happiness for ordinary women and men across the US? Well, it turns out that nothing compares to really marriage when it comes to the pursuit of happiness, that Jeffersonian phrase that I mentioned at the beginning. So again, the culture tells us that it's about education, it's about money, it's about work. But the data tell us a different story. So my book, for instance, kind of looks at the relationship between education, money, work, just being married, and being in a good marriage here in green. And you can see here, if you look closely, it's probably hard for folks in the back, but yes, getting a college degree at a university like the one we're in boosts your odds of happiness by 64%. Having a higher than average income boosts your odds of happiness by 88%. Having a good job boosts your happiness by about 145%. So it's not kind of, it's not wrong to think about things like education, work, and money, but just simply being married is even more powerful predictor for ordinary folks of being very happy with their lives. And then being in a good marriage boosts your odds of being very happy by 545%. Okay. And what's, I think, noteworthy about this statistic here is that in the general social survey, the GSS, that Mark and I have looked at over the years, there's no variable that compares to marital quality. Again, not money, not work, not sexual frequency, not self-rated health, not even religious attendance. This is the biggest factor for ordinary Americans in predicting whether or not they're very happy with their lives, okay? And this is not obviously kind of a finding that gets a lot of attention in our contemporary pop culture and in the media and in our schools and universities in the main. Mentioned we kind of flip the equation a little bit and think about what are the trends in unhappiness, as we're seeing more and more Americans report that they're unhappy in this country, in this culture. What this is kind of showing us is the folks who are unmarried are this top line right here, and the folks who are married are this bottom line here, aged 18 to 55. So kind of the epidemic, if you will, of unhappiness is concentrated more among unmarried Americans than it is married Americans. So I'm thinking, for instance, of women like Taylor, a woman from the Rocky Mountain West who I profile in the book. And she kind of prioritized the Midas mindset in her 20s, or she prioritized kind of the mammon over marriage in her 20s. And now she's having second thoughts about this. She says, as a young woman, she was told, don't get married too young, go out and see the world and do all these other things, and don't get attached to anyone too quickly. She took this advice and pursued a career in digital marketing in her 20s, rather than kind of dating with an eye to getting married in her 20s. Now, though, she's wondering about this strategy. She says, I look back on that advice and I'm like, if I could do it again, I would actually focus on finding a husband a little bit more. She says, I don't have like a ton of meaning in my life right now. And she also says the time that she spends babysitting for her nieces and nephews, time that she loves, has left her thinking that she would have been more fulfilled if she were married with kids. She says, the older I get, I wonder if there's a chance that I could have a family of my own right now, do fun things with them, finger paint, whatever. I don't know what kids do, okay? So there's a lot of regret in Taylor's in mind right now as a sort of mid-30-something woman about kind of how she focused more on career rather than on trying to find a spouse and have kids, in her 20s. Now, of course, I think everyone here knows there are plenty of single adults who are flourishing. But I'm just saying that on average, this kind of rise in unhappiness that we're seeing play out in the US is concentrated among unmarried, both men and women. And it's often, I think, not reflected in a lot of the coverage of marriage and family and motherhood that we see in our media and other cultural domains. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to kind of go through the entirety of Catherine's story, but it's kind of a contrast to Taylor's story. Catherine's a married mother of two in Virginia. She's Catholic, and she just talks about how kind of her life is more difficult now with two young kids. She's expecting her third child actually now, because the care of, young kids forces her to, she says, really die to myself and become more selfless. Talks about she's got less time to go eating out, less time to follow her favorite female bloggers. So in their sacrifices about being a married mom, for Catherine. But as she kind of puts things into a broader perspective, she says that she's kind of feels more compassionate, more charitable, and more connected as both a wife and mother. And that from her perspective, quote, I think there's a deeper fulfillment there when it comes to being a married mom for Catherine. And again, her kind of experience is actually typical of sort of how women in general would kind of report when it comes to happiness, because what we see in the data in the GSS is that there's no group of women or men 18 to 55 who are happier than married fathers and married mothers. Again, you're not really going to get that fact pattern reported on the mainstream media, but it is what we see in the data. And Catherine's kind of an example of the more positive story. So what I'm suggesting to you today is that kind of the path to prosperity and happiness actually runs through marriage and family. And I'm not trying to kind of paint a rose-colored portrait here. Today, or in my book, I kind of acknowledge that there are many stresses and strains and sacrifices that most of us experience as spouses and parents. But just when you kind of compare the reality of family life to the reality of kind of lifelong singledom, what you see is that for most of us, we're more likely to flourish in this sort of this social, this communal context that is, the family. Okay, so having made this point, what do we do with all of this? Okay. How do we think about ways to kind of reverse the closing of the American heart? How do we kind of make marriage and family life more appealing and more accessible to ordinary young adults? So one thing is to think about how we can create a culture that's more conducive to flourishing for young men and teenage boys. Because one of the things that I hear from my UVA women is that they feel like a lot of the guys in their social circles are not flourishing. They're not responsible. They're not worthy of commitment. They're not interested in commitment. They don't really have a sense of, clear identity. They don't kind of give them confidence as potential, spouses, husbands. So what do we do? Well, I think we can encourage our teenage boys and young men to be more deliberate about kind of discerning their gifts, figuring out kind of what they're good at and how that might link to some kind of career. And being very explicit too, with apologies to our hosts today, that probably most young men should not go to college, but there are many good sort of technical tracks that they could sort of pursue and do well at professionally. But for those who are kind of heading towards college, or obviously in college, kind of taking that more seriously, again, we do see that women tend to do better in high school and college. And that's in part, I think, a reflection of the ways in which a lot of young men are not taking high school or some kind of trade school or college seriously enough. And then too, to kind of embrace a sense of like their vocation, that they're called to do something meaningful and powerful as men in the workplace. And this will kind of give them obviously a better income over time and a sense of self-identity that makes them more attractive to potential partners and spouses down the road. But kind of just think about ways we kind of can build up men's connection to education, to the trades, and then to stronger start professionally in the early 20s. That in doing these things, men will benefit in terms of have a better sense of their own self-identity, and teenage boys as well. And they'll become more attractive to the girls and women in their lives in ways that will make them, better husbands down the road. So part of the work we have to do is trying to, basically help young men, man up. Okay, so the second thought here, and this goes to Mark's comments about online dating, is that my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, has looked at just the association between kind of where you met someone and how happy you are in your marriage. And this is for folks who are 18 to 35 in this IFS study that Wendy Wang did for us. And what you can see here, if you're close to the screen, and this is probably good news for everyone here, is that the folks who are the most happy in their marriages are folks who met in some kind of religious context. Could be at church, it could be a kind of a youth group, could be a college ministry, you know, whatever. Okay, so clearly folks who are meeting in a religious context are the ones most likely to be flourishing in their marriages today. Then it's some kind of like social events, you know, a party of some sort with friends, probably. Then it's, as my wife and I did, we met at the University of Virginia, meeting in college. That's the third kind of most kind of positive pattern here. Then at work, then just through friends, then family, then online. And then the bottom category here is in a bar or restaurant. So something about meeting in a bar, you know, some of you may have been in a bar, but, you know, hopefully you're the exception here. But I think one other way to think about this too is just that we are incarnational creatures, right? And so having the opportunity to kind of meet someone in person, get to know them in a variety of ways in person ends up being probably more helpful than just, you know, kind of scrolling through some kind of, you know, dating app and trying to figure out from that context. And again, I have good friends in Charlottesville who are married through dating apps and doing well. But I'm just saying, in general, if we could think about more ways to cultivate that in-person meet, that would be great. The third thing here is, again, for kind of the young men and the young men in your lives to sort of think about, ruminate, is to encourage them to, quote, ask her out, right? And I'm thinking here of a story that was told by Arthur Brooks, who is now a professor at Harvard. He was the head of the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, where I have an affiliation, think tank in Washington, D.C. And he talks about being actually a musician in his early 20s, and he was traveling through Europe, played an event in Barcelona, and he happened to see this woman, Esther, who really caught his fancy, and he asked her out. He was brave, he was concrete, and he was persistent. He talks about it in this way. He says, of course, having met her, I had to convince Esther. So I tackled the project as if it were a startup. I began by studying Spanish. I didn't even know her language. Before long, I quit my job and moved to her native Barcelona, where I knew no one except her, in hot pursuit. The market pressure was intense. Men would shout wedding proposals to her from moving cars. But I pressed on, undeterred. It took 2 years to close the deal, but she finally said yes, and we married. Okay. And you have, you know, other quotes from him on that. Now, obviously, not all of us guys are as sort of, you know, talented as Arthur Brooks is. He's a very talented guy. Great speaker, great thinker, great writer, writes for The Atlantic now, a great musician. But the point I'm trying to make here for us ordinary male mortals is that we need to kind of take that initiative. And why am I saying this should be kind of the guy taking that initiative? Well, what we see social, sort of from a social science perspective, is that women perceive this, one, as a sign of genuine interest in them, okay? Secondly, they kind of either explicitly or implicitly kind of appreciate that it takes a certain measure of courage to ask them out. And courage in men is actually pretty appreciated by women. And then third, I think it kind of basically takes at least some part of, in a sense, the relationship responsibility and puts it on kind of the male shoulders. Whereas particularly today, a lot of the responsibilities for relationships tend to kind of run with the young women. So, and we actually see that between 80 and 90% of women who are asked about this issue of who you like to ask first, the guy or the gal, when it comes to making that first move, women report in overwhelming numbers they would prefer that the guy would make that first move. Okay, so I would just encourage men to ask women out, understanding that sometimes you're going to fall flat on your face, and then you just move on. Okay, the fourth thing, we're almost done here. I know people are probably hungry for lunch, is don't live together. And this is, as you probably can gather, I'm teaching at a public university in Virginia, and I'm probably the most conservative professor. I'm sure the most, you know, that they are exposed to at UVA. And I tell them a lot of things that are surprising to them and controversial to them. But this is the most controversial thing and surprising thing that I tell my students, because almost all of them think that, you know, the way you should prepare for marriage is to live with someone. And it makes sense, right? Like if you want to be a good soccer player, you do a lot of practice. If you want to be a good teacher, you get a lot of practice in front of a classroom. if you want to be a good piano player, you play the piano a lot. So you would think when it comes to marriage, the best way to prepare for marriage is to try out the relationship in a co-residential context. But what we're seeing in a lot of different studies is that that's actually not a good idea, because those who are marrying directly, for instance, in their 20s, actually tend to be happier, more sexually satisfied, and less likely to get divorced than their peers who are having multiple relationships with people that also might include cohabitation. Just going to give you one figure that kind of illustrates the point here. This is from a Stanford scholar, Professor Rosenfeld at Stanford in sociology, who is not a conservative, I can assure you, but he is an empirical, family sociologist. And what he's doing here is just sort of graphing out women's risk of divorce. And this is purple, where you're cohabiting with someone besides your first husband and your first husband. And this is green, where you're cohabiting with someone besides your husband. And then this is just sort of no cohabitation in blue, or cohabiting with your husband here in red. It's kind of like, in some ways, like what we would in the Catholic tradition call like a natural marriage back in the day, many centuries ago. But the point here simply is that when you cohabit with someone who's not your spouse, your risk of divorce, in this case for women, it's also true basically for men, increases dramatically. And we're not entirely sure why that's the case. My own hypothesis is that it kind of fosters kind of an insidious comparison, right? So I'm married to John, and John's a really great guy, but he's not as sort of charismatic as David. He's not as ambitious as William. He's not as romantic as Charles, right? So that's, I think, the dynamic that may be kind of helping to explain. But there's just something about having multiple cohabiting partners prior to marriage that puts you at risk of much higher likelihood of landing in divorce court. So the story here is to encourage folks not to live together, but instead to be more intentional about dating with an eye towards marriage. And you can find out a lot about your potential spouse by doing things like volunteering at a homeless shelter, or working with big brothers or big sisters, and the list goes on. And the final thing, appropriately enough, here is just to kind of make a plug for shared faith for our young adults when it comes to steering onto a path of marital success. And even today, a lot of young adults, particularly younger women, kind of think about marriage, I would say, and love in overly romanticized terms that kind of embrace what I would call like the soulmate myth. It's all about that butterfly feeling in your stomach when you first meet someone, you're first with someone. You kind of have this idea that this is going to be we're going to be in cloud nine, sort of from here on out. But by contrast, for people who are kind of embedded in a faith community, hopefully they get a bit more realistic vision of like what marriage is all about and the challenges that attend to marriage. And even more importantly, they come to understand that marriage is not about kind of that butterfly feeling, as good as that can be for us. It's about willing the good of the other, obviously, to kind of paraphrase St. Thomas Aquinas. And so marriage is an opportunity for us to grow in love, both for our spouse and for our children and for our kin. And that people who have a common faith in America today are more likely to embrace this sort of more family-first approach to marriage and love that ends up being not only more stable, but also actually more conducive to fulfillment and happiness kind of over the long term in their marriages. So taking steps like the ones that I've just articulated can put one on the road not only to marrying, but to forging the kind of strong and stable marriage that's most likely to give us, to give you, to give young adults in general a shot at that classic American pursuit that Jefferson articulated in the Declaration, that is the pursuit of happiness. And more importantly, I would say also, and this comes to the bottom part of my subtitle here, is that by embracing marriage and family, by opening your heart to married love, you can do your own part to save our civilization. So thank you.
Thank you, Brad, Mark, and JP. Wow, what a morning. So I've got a lot in my head that I've been scribbling away notes on, and I see lots of other people doing the same. So we will proceed now to our fourth speaker, you may have noticed so far that all three of our speakers were male. And now for something completely different, as Monty Python used to say. I'd like Kathy to give us just a brief reflection, kind of tee up the Q&A panel discussion part of that.
So I thought I'd give you a little bit of background for those of you who may not know me. I've run into so many friends that I've gotten to know over these 50 years here in Houston. So married 50 years with my dear husband, Joe. So give you a little back. I'm originally from Rhode Island. I'm from a family of 5 girls, no brothers. So God does have a sense of humor. My dad was in the Navy. I've lived all over the world. Decided to go to college in New Orleans. It was like another country to me. They ate funny, they talked funny, and I grew to love it. Went to Loyola University and had a lot of the Ignatian spirituality that influenced my life in many ways. My husband is from El Paso, of a Mexican and Spanish background. I'm Irish Italian. So when we think about people, God putting people together, he put us together. Joe finished at Tulane and medical school and came to Houston to do a pediatric residency. I was finishing up at Loyola. I was an education major. I graduated on a Monday. We had rehearsal on Tuesday and we got married on Wednesday. So we always teased. We started out on fast forward, and it's only been about the last maybe 10 years that we've kind of had a little pause. 7 of our sons are married and we have 22 grandchildren, but we do have girls in the next generation. So we girls are catching up. My life has been just a fascinating kind of story. I feel very much that so much of what has been a part of my life is my faith and my trusting in God. My decision to marry Joe was kind of one of those times because I had options. We've heard a lot today about options and, choices that we make. And I had options, but I also had met this incredibly wonderful man. And through my prayer life, decided, yes, this was the time to marry. And then, people say, did you want a big family? We did. I came from a family of 5 girls. We were very close in age. They are my best friends to this day. But I tell people, yeah, Joe wanted 5 and I wanted 5. Do the math. Didn't exactly kind of work that way. It actually is my faith journey. And in that we wanted 5. And I wanted them close. And so God was very good. We were blessed. We had our 5 sons. But having 5 sons under the age of 6 was a little bit like, oh my gosh, this is a little overwhelming. 3 in diapers, Joe's hours were horrible. How am I going to do this? Well, I was blessed by a pastor who, at a parish we were in at the time, decided that we were going to have an adoration chapel, the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm at church one day when he's introducing this to our community. And I'm thinking, he's saying, just dedicate 1 hour to the Lord. And I'm going, oh my gosh, where am I going to find 1 hour to just sit in a chapel? I remember exactly what I was thinking, just sitting in a chapel. But he ended his presentation with a very simple statement that literally led me to change my whole way of thinking and very much my faith life. I promise you 1 hour of peace and quiet. You're the mother of 5 boys under the age of 6. You did not have peace and quiet. I signed up. And it's during that time that I learned a couple things that really to discern, as the Jesuits would often teach us, to discern what was God's will for me in my life. But I also learned the importance of silence in our prayer life. And that was huge. I had been doing all the talking, and now I had a chance to listen. And in that listening, God was calling Joe and I to have more children. So it's very much my journey of having those next 5 children. And I tell you, he never looked back. We learned to trust God and to move forward. So today has been kind of interesting because here I am, the mother of 10 sons, and so much of the focus has been on fathers. And and what their role is and how important that is. And I think it started for Joe and I. Well, number one, Joe is a wonderful example to the boys. He showed them that, yes, this is a partnership. He wasn't afraid to, give them a bath, and he wasn't afraid to help cook. And he had to cook a lot in certain times because I get extremely nauseated and cannot look at food for many nights during a pregnancy. So he had to learn to cook because you can't take him out to dinner every night. And so there was a partnership there. But I think just the way Joe and I believed in who and what we are, what did we want in each of our own lives, in our marriage, and for our family? And I think it's a question all of us have to ask ourselves and then instill in our children and our young people. What do you really want in life? Are we chasing the American dream, which I heard from, I can't think of the author. I was just trying to look it up real quick, from the book Habits of the Heart. And he was here speaking at another conference years ago. Thank you. Anyway, it was Habits of the Heart. And he talked about the American dream. Are we chasing the American dream of more and bigger and better? And people say, well, you had more and you had bigger. I like to think better, but not in that context. And so Joe and I had to say, what was really important? It's who we are and what we're doing with the gifts God's given us and how we live our lives. That matters. And we've tried, and I think we have instilled that in our sons. But I think we all have to ask that question. Are we chasing the more, the bigger, and the better at the expense of our relationships? Tell you one simple story, and then I know there's questions. He's on top of us. So I had given a talk many years ago. Actually, it was at a little preschool in our neighborhood. I got a call from a mom who said her pediatrician, who I think is here, said, oh, you need to see if you can get Kathy to come and speak to your little group, which I did. Ran into this woman a few weeks later, and she told me, you changed my life and saved my marriage. And of course, I just started doing this, and this was freaking me out a little bit. Like, oh my gosh, what did I say? But I used that example. Are we chasing the wrong dreams? So she shared with me, and she fell apart in the middle of Sam's and said, when we got married, we moved into the home my husband already had. But I wanted to live in this other home in this other neighborhood. I had friends that had this and they had that. And it was really starting to tear our marriage apart. I started, when I heard your words, I thought, am I willing to throw my marriage away for a house? I went home and asked my husband, well, can we remodel it? Can we update it? And he said, well, do you want to stay here? And she said, yes. She said, I believe it changed my thinking. So who we are, what we're doing with the gifts God's given us, and how we lead our lives is really what's going to matter to our children. I'm often heard, what's wrong with our children today? I don't look at it that way. I think what's wrong with our children is what's wrong with the adults in their lives. So we are the ones that have to set that tone. We have to show our sons and our daughters, what is a marriage? What works together? Learning about expectations and assumptions. One of our biggest challenges early on, expectations of what Joe grew up with, what I grew up with. And, that doesn't go away. 50 years and we still have issues. Sometimes I expect this or I assume this and vice versa. But literally, it's that who we are, what we're doing with the gifts God's given us. It's not, whether you're in this profession, you're making that much money, you're driving this kind of car. It's listening to God, discerning what his will is in your life. And then you will be happy because you're doing the will of God.
Thank you, Kathy.
This is a general question, but is there data? You talked about good marriages, and I guess one question would be, how do you measure good marriage? But is there data to support that even a bad marriage is better than no marriage at all? And part of the question is, I get from a fair number of young people that the chance of having a bad marriage is so bad that it's not worth taking the risk. To get a good marriage is not worth taking the risk of a bad marriage.
Offer a couple more in a second. One of the
Thank you.
problems with one of the problems with that kind of good and bad dichotomy is it sounds like it's the 0-1. You either have it or you don't have it, or you have the other one, right? And it reminds me of the 2012 study I did on children growing up in different kinds of households. Got me in a ton of trouble at UT, but navigated that. But one of the things that we didn't talk much about in that entire process is that none of that study of family structure and who was in your household had anything to do with mother's and father's happiness, right? Marital and parental happiness was not a part of that. And still the distinctions in how your children turned out were profound. So I've always thought, and I think I wrote about it in First Things, forget the name of the title of it, but basically a broken shelter or how does it, like an unsightly house still provides shelter. And so, and one of the points I had in here that I didn't talk about, sort of things that we can do, is like help people strengthen, repair things that are going wrong in their marriage. Now, a lot of times they're not interested in that at all by the time it has become noted. But I'm a big fan of saying that, the subjective temperature of your marriage is not such a good thing to take all the time. And that I look at my own marriage, 30 years, met her at 18. We had a lot to learn, and we had some serious hurdles to overcome. Very glad I stuck with it, right? There was an early time when we weren't sure if it was going to happen, but I just am not. Two people who want to make it work can do so no matter what the problem is. They just have to want it bad enough and work at it. So I'm a skeptic on sort of like, oh, this is a terrible marriage. Again, marriage is something that one half of the pair can kill, right? So it can be killed against your will. It's happening in a very close family member right now against his will. It breaks my heart, but I tend not to think of these things as sort of a subjective, measurable good versus bad.
I see JP's hand up. So go ahead, JP.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and a very real concern that is often expressed. We did some research when we were starting off trying to understand why young people might avoid marriage or seek marriage. We did a project with an organization called the Right Brain People, and the emotional fear of avoiding the trauma of past family hurt or the horror stories that people hear and know about is very real. And so I think one of the practical ways that the church can do is to help folks know there's a lot of academic literature that has been developed, that's well researched, shows that it's not a mystery how one can know and discern the right spouse and to enter into a marriage in a healthy way. The more that an individual know, the more agency that they have, and the better they are at discerning it. I have 3 teenagers, and I read to my teenagers a couple of years ago the book How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk, and I told them it's far too late for your mother, but it's not too late for you. And so there's just some very practical things. And so it's why we talk with churches about the importance of ministry that teaches singles the skills of just of effective relationship discernment. And does the person make you a better version of yourself or a worse version of yourself? Are you closer to God as a result of this person, further from God as a result of this person? And then there's certain repetitive habits in people I've seen over a period of time that you can discern. And so there are helpful specific things. And so just teaching those can really move the needle and removing the fear and giving people agency.
Thanks, JP.
The only thing that I would add to these comments that are I think they're on the money is just to sort of stress the importance of people recognizing that the paradox of marital happiness for most people is that if you pursue it directly, you're not going to get it, right? If you want to be like in this happy, incredible marriage, that's going to reduce your odds of being happily married. By contrast of trying to be a good spouse to your wife, to your husband, and a good father and mother to your kids, generally speaking, you're gonna enjoy a happy marriage, a satisfying life. So and it's the same thing too in terms of like folks who are kind of worried about, for instance, getting divorced, and so they might have a prenup, and it's a more kind of individualistic, I'm going to kind of hedge my bets here kind of approach to their marriage. And of course, not surprisingly, folks who have a prenup, are more likely to be thinking about divorce, and they're less happy in their marriages. So it's just one of those things where marriage is kind of an all-in institution. And if you embrace that character, the all-in character, and you obviously make a good decision, apropos of, JP's point about not marrying a jerk, then, most of the time you'll be flourishing. But of course, everyone's been married, like many of us have for many years. We'll have days, weeks, months, even years when there can be, profound strain or disappointment. So I'm not kind of promising like, a rose-colored, model, but I'm saying that in the main, most of the time, you're more likely to be flourishing when you kind of have this family first approach to married life.
You kind of brought up something. You said bad marriages. There's also issues within a marriage, and there's a couple that'll come to mind. Abuse, and that can be physical, emotional, mental. And there's also the issue of addictions, and especially drug, alcohol addictions. And, when you're involved in a family, if it's just the couple, that's one issue. But when you start bringing children into that, you have to look at the effect on those addictions on the children, and or how that abuse is coming through. And I've experienced that twice, with sisters and stuff. And it's tough. It's really hard. But, as a mother, and if I'm worried about the children, it's not always the mother that is having to deal with it. Sometimes it's the father, and where they stand and how they're going to protect those children. So, it's hard to define what a bad marriage is and good. I look at my husband's parents and my own. Mom and dad were married 70, going on 76 years when my dad died at 95. And Joe's same thing. They were way up, probably close to 70 years. They didn't have what you would look at as perfect marriages. I mean, Joe and I looked at them and said, it's not what we want. There's a lot that they did that was wonderful, but there was a lot that we did not want to emulate. And so we had to look at that, and how do we as a couple change that within our own marriage? Would I call them great marriages? No, they were good marriages. They were committed to each other, and went through those ups and down times, but I didn't call them a bad marriage. They were just not what Joe and I wanted. So I don't know how to answer that, except that it depends on what that bad is and where it fits. But when it comes to children, I'm sorry, you have to protect those children. And if it's has anything to do with abuse or addictions and things like that, then we fight for those children.
Thank you. Others? Who's up next? Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to play devil's advocate for a minute. So, Dr. Wilcox, you gave some suggestions, or practical suggestions for men, and I really liked them. But I can imagine either a child or an undergrad hypothetically saying, you want me to take college seriously and embrace a vocation, meaning I'm supposed to be called to do something really important in the workplace. And then you told me that the main problem is that people are focusing on their careers and education and money way too much. So which is it? And why didn't you give the same advice to women? And so what am I supposed to do with this? You seem to be telling me this is the means to this larger end.
Sure. That's a great question. So I think it comes to kind of, so there's a happy, medium here via media that I would be thinking about in terms of just young men today and teenage boys. that, so for some of the, the both male and female students that I deal with at UVA, they're on the kind of uber successful track. They are extremely hardworking, very professionally oriented. And I think they're getting, as I was saying, kind of like the Midas mindset often message, and they're kind of following that. But there is, another segment of the population, and we do see this especially among teenage males and young men who are just not very engaged with much of anything, not with their schooling, not with any hobbies, not with work when they're in their early 20s. And so it's sort of that group of young men, especially young males, that I'm trying to think about how do we kind of help them to realize and recognize that work is not obviously the only thing or everything, but it is an important part of a life well lived. And it also is important in terms of making you kind of develop a sense of self-confidence to become more attractive to the opposite sex and to become a good husband. So yeah, the subtle point is to kind of say, don't overplay work, don't overplay money. But for a lot of these younger men and teenage guys who are kind of coming up, to realize that they need to prepare for a world where they're going to be, if they're going to flourish, a husband and father. And even today in 2024, we see in my own research in the book is that married moms are happiest when they are married to a guy who is a good provider, who is employed full time, who they rate subjectively as a good provider. And so in terms of women's happiness in marriage and men's happiness in marriage, we don't see right now in my data like a big difference between working wives and stay-at-home wives. But we do see a very large difference for couples in guys who are not employed full-time as husbands, and guys who are. So I'm just sort of saying, if you think about kind of the importance of full-time work for men as husbands, you gotta get and also as potential, prospects, marital and romantic prospects, and the fact that more than basically 1 in 5 men in their prime years are not working full-time today, record territory. We just need to think about ways to kind of get our teenage boys and young men, as I said, to kind of man up and be more intentional about their education, their self-development, and their job prospects, but not go in the direction of overplaying it with, and that's where the Midas mindset comes in. Does that respond to your concern? Yeah.
I understand there are numerous stressors on young married couples. Well, my question has to do with the effect of reducing those stressors, possibly by doing more pre and postnatal care, more child care centers, maybe time off for both parents after a birth to come together, to bond, to learn how to parent, but also to buy the time for them to maybe grow together. And I'm not familiar with any research on that, but you experts probably are.
I'll jump in a little bit. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of stressors out there, and I see it with our sons that are married. Many of them have gone into professions that are not the higher income professions. Even our older son, Tony, is a pediatrician, but he ended up going over to Africa for the first 15 years. I remember running into a mom and she was all excited. He's a doctor. And, where is he? And I said, he's actually working in Africa. Her comment was, he's not going to make a whole lot of money doing that. And I said, maybe he didn't go into medicine to make money. Anyway. And so, it's the stress is there. They're in education, which meant their wives have chosen to work too in order to make ends meet. And then it was the daycare situation is very expensive, and to get quality daycare is really a problem. So we need to work on that as a society, looking at how do we make it easier for couples to take time off. Joe never got time off. To come and stay home. I was fortunate to have a mother that came for every single one of them. And so we as a community need to reach out to each other. If you see a young mom that needs help, to reach out, whether it's in our churches, in our parishes, in our schools. And that goes not just for the young, for the old. We have, Mother Teresa tells us, our little reading today, it's not about poverty of having a house and food. It's about loneliness, and how many people, as was mentioned here, are lonely. So yeah, I think we have to reduce those stresses. And if we can, as the parents or friends in our community, and we see that, I couldn't have done it without friends and friends here. I had no family here in town. So without those people that say, Kathy, I'll come take care of the boys when you go pick up the others so you don't have to wake up the babies. Or I'm going to the doctors and someone says, I'll take care of the other kids while you take them into the pediatrician for that ear infection. It's being that support for each other. And then policy changes are critical.
Thank you. JP's hand is up.
Yeah. I love that answer. Just adding to it, right? With the decline of the extended family, right? It is so incumbent on the local church, right, to provide the kind of community and ongoing support where a couple not only as we prepare for marriage, but then after marriage, that wedding day, life can be lived in an authentic Christian community because life happens, right? And I know my friends, Mary Rose and Ryan Verrett are there, who are the founders of Witness to Love, a really phenomenal mentor-based ministry that really gets couples well connected with other couples and in living life together. When Communio works with an individual local church, the idea is how do we build the interlocking relationships in and through the local church so that a couple at those early stages of marriage, right, the full time, the most frequently occurring time when people get divorces in those first years, okay, and there's all the physical challenges of early parenthood and all of the financial challenges where your income is low relative to the rest of your life. How are we architected in the individual local church to be able to help that young couple grow in a life of holiness? Frequently in local churches, we think in terms of a men's group, a women's group. Ultimately, I don't have a vocation. I tell people when I talk to Catholic audiences, I don't have a vocation to be a man. I have a vocation to be a married man. That's my vocation. And so help me grow in that vocation. And so looking at your average church, what are we doing there? And there's so much more that can and should be done. And my colleague Jimmy Abreu is somewhere there floating around in the back of the room. He works with me and working with in different parts of the country, and I know he would be happy to circle back with any of you if you have questions.
First, I'd like to thank y'all for doing this conference, and hopefully this is the first of many that will be reconvening. But mine is proactive in that, okay, we got a lot of energy and time, talent, and treasure in the room. What 3 things should we do now?
Yeah, I think, that comment that came up, I think marriage prep is essential. We did it for 28 years, Joe and I, and we used a program called Better and Forever. It was a one-on-one with couples, and you met with them in your home, 5 weeks, over about 5 weeks. We got to know them. They got to know us. They were able to open up to us, and we developed a relationship with them. Many of them, we are still friends with them. So in fact, we've done it for so long and had done it for so long. They have grandchildren. So, gives you an idea of where we are. Their children are marrying, but it's essential in building that relationship where they can call us and feel comfortable. We're struggling, and maybe just one of them saying, we're having a hard time. I don't know what to do. Bringing them together, having dinner together. They ate with us. They came. We had chaos at dinner, whatever was going on, but they saw what it was like to have family, and then to break up and meet and develop those relationships. We need that. I was in a parish once and I said, "What are you doing for marriage prep?" And I got a shrug, and I thought, "Oh dear, that's not good. We need marriage prep."
I'll throw in there, not to disagree, there's a ubiquitousness of marriage prep. If you're going to get married in the Catholic world, for instance, you can't do it. No priest that's worth his ordination is going to celebrate, witness the marriage without it. Obviously, I know the desires for great and effective marriage prep, which is what she's saying, and I agree with. And after marriage, there's so little after the wedding day. If you think about your average church, Protestant or Catholic, after the wedding day, there's nothing that exists until there's a problem. Okay. And the question I would ask, I think that was Larry's question. The question is, like, what do we do? Go to your pastor and ask him, what are we doing right now for marriages? People are already married. What are we doing for them? Okay. Ask the question, if after church on Sunday, if you were to say to somebody that you went to a marriage class last weekend, what would their reaction be? Okay. If you think in hearing this, that if I told you I went to a marriage class last week or a marriage retreat last week, if you hear that and think there might be something wrong with JP's marriage, then we have to own that we are part of this problem, right? That there is a stigma associated with investing in your marriage that people have. Spiritually, if you think about it, if I were to sit on a spiritual retreat last week, nobody would think there's something wrong. I know JPs are, gosh, are you falling, no longer believing in Jesus? No one would say it, but I said I went on a marriage retreat, somebody would conclude, what's going wrong with JP's marriage, right? And we have to make it normative to grow in holiness in this life is to invest in the primary relationship God has given me, and that's with my spouse. And so at the local parish, it needs normative from long after the wedding day until death do you part.
So we've got two answers to Larry's question: high quality marriage prep, and then working with people after the wedding day, which we don't do much of. Mark, Brad?
Just a quick pitch for the marriage course. I think it's the flip side of the Alpha course out of Holy Trinity Brompton, I think it is. We did that when we were Presbyterians a long time ago, and just fabulous, right? Around, they did dinner. You seated for a salad. You have questions to talk about. You watch the video. You seated for main course. You have questions to talk about. Same thing before dessert, and then we did that, I think, 6 different times. That was great. And then the people who are graduates of it help with it, and I loved helping with that. That's one thing that comes to mind. It's marriage maintenance, really, and that was exceptional. And churches and parishes can do it. It takes some work. It takes some investment, but it was fabulous.
So we can think about this in terms of 3 different domains, basically, broadly speaking, church, education, and the state. And I think one kind of easy way to kind of capture the comments that were made by Kathy and Mark, and obviously JP, is to suggest that everyone who's here at a Protestant or a Catholic church sign up with Communio, and they can kind of take care of a lot of these different dimensions of family formation and marriage support that would be, I think, great for everyone. So moving beyond that sort of church point, I would say when it comes to education, trying to get kind of better kind of love relationship family education into Catholic and other private and public schools in the area. Working maybe with the state, for instance, on what's called the success sequence would be kind of one way to do that at the state level here in Texas. And then that beyond the education piece, for kind of just schools, I think too, thinking about, working with local youth groups here, either in your churches or kind of freestanding, to kind of give teenagers, basically an inoculation against what they're seeing on TikTok and Instagram, and you can imagine how that would work. With some compelling young adults leading teenagers on a better path. And the final piece in terms of the state is just to kind of be advocates for public policies tackling things like social media, pornography, and sort of how they're interacting with, especially with our kids, but also obviously adults. And there are bills and legislation that are kind of either pending in Austin or going to be on deck in Austin related to technology. And that's an increasing issue for a lot of teenagers and their parents, myself included. It was just helping our kids navigate the devices, which can be really powerfully negative influences on, family dynamics, and then also their kind of conceptions about what's good and true and ideal for love and sex and marriage. And then at the state level too, just thinking about policies like the child tax credit. This goes to sort of the gentleman's question over here in terms of what we can do to create better context for parents. And there are other kinds of pro-family policies too that you can make to engage with in Austin, just sort of down the road.
Thank you. Yeah. Just to emphasize one of those points, a whole lot of marriages stumble right out of the gate. A whole lot of divorces happen within the first 5 years. which is not to say they don't happen after that, but if we had to pick a place to start with our local pastor, with our local church, zeroing in on what are we doing for couples from wedding day to their 5th anniversary would be a great place to start.
First of all, thank you for your presentations. I'm one of the canon lawyers of the diocese, and when someone comes to us with declaration of nullity, we're having to look at the moment of consent to see whether they truly intended and knew and wanted what marriage is in the eyes of the church. With the societal issues you're looking at, that's one of the questions we're working with and struggling with in the canonical world. How is society influencing their ability to give consent? Do you maybe have any comments on that?
Kevin, could you recapitulate that for me? Just, I want to make sure I understood the question.
Yeah. So Father Millet's asking about reflections on the issue of sort of full consent to what the church understands marriage to be. Is that correct? How societal pressures and forces are affecting people's ability to give full, pulling them in directions other than giving full consent there, even their understanding of what they're doing.
Right. I mean, it strikes me that most of what the church teaches about what the essences of marriage is increasingly divergent from the cultural messaging that people are getting. And so if you have a modest premarital education, right, which I think a ton of people have had, I mean, it's not hard for clinicians to find like, wow, they did not know what they were doing. How did that get through? How did they, So I think it's absolutely pivotal to help people understand what's expected of them. Plus, then they have to kind of butt up against this idea that, okay, yeah, I know the Catholic Church says this, but in reality, like they don't care that much about it, right? There's this formal rule, but informally everybody ignores it, which is again, for your sake, you have to push through that as well. And the premarital education can't be unserious about it, right? So I do think about the premarital prep program we talked about a little bit earlier as almost guaranteeing that they can't not know what marriage is about, right? And that kind of thing can have a dramatic difference in the kinds of cases I think that would come before such a commission, or even that probably wouldn't come at all because they would be well formed.
First of all, I want to thank you, Kevin, for putting this together. It's a fabulous presentations of the 4 presenters, including you, Kathy, with 10 sons and practical experience on a daily basis of what it means to live sacrificial love. The third speaker has written this book on the pursuit of happiness, and not only pursuit of happiness, but the closing of the American heart. The American mind and heart have both been closed. It is inherent in the roots of the cultural formation. Robert Bellah and his colleagues did a masterful study on this in Habits of the Heart, followed up by the Good Society. When we look at the question that was raised by Father Millet, it is true. To what extent can people's hearts be open in the pre-marriage preparation for them to make a consent in which they're going to be there for rich or for poor, sickness and health, until death do we part? Those 42 words are absolutely incredible. And what they imply is that both of these people coming together in a spousal relationship are going to live the Paschal mystery. Our task as a church is to present the love of the Paschal mystery as the only way to happiness. Only way. There is no other way. And that means an ongoing dying to the self. In a culture which puts the self beyond and above the community and a necessity of making any contribution to that community only to the extent that you are going to satisfy your personal interest. Everything that we have heard here today in the data points to the fact that when people go into the marriage, it is a contract and it is not a covenant. And it is a contract which they can break at any time if either of the spouses does not measure up to what they expected in the contract. And the contract is always about how you're going to satisfy me. You, Kathy, and Joe had to struggle with that all the time. Naturally, as you said, you have to look at your own well-being, the well-being of the relationship, and then the contribution to the community. But our task as a church and in the parish, and that's where the rubber hits the road. I am privileged as a priest to sit in the confessional and hear people come to me to talk about the brokenness of their lives. And they are broken. People are looking for someone to give them the vision. John Paul II, in his Novo Millennio Ineunte, which is his first encyclical after the millennium, says in number 43, go and read it. The greatest challenge for the church in the coming millennium is going to be to live the spirituality of Communio. Immediately when you say Communio, you say relationships. And immediately when you say relationships, you have to have love. There are no relationships without love. And then he says, the first reaction is going to be to jump in there and say, which programs can we form? Wrong, he says, wrong. Sorry. What you really have to look at is each other and see a gift. And in the receiving and the giving of the gifts is where the dying rising takes place. I would suggest to you that Pope Francis has a wonderful formula for what we should be doing in a parish. Encountering people. Encountering people is the first way we relate. Secondly, not just to encounter, but to accompany. And you're talking about that, Kathy, and what you did at the table and you calling up and so forth. It's very practical. You accompany for what? Here is what I think, I'm sorry, that the center does very well, and that is to learn how to dialogue. Need I say more about our culture? When you have our presidential candidates screaming hate and division, and then we come down into our house and we see hate and division. And finally, why do dialogue? To discern what you're going to do in the marriage to make the sacrifices appropriately. I want to thank you very much. I mean, your research has overwhelmed me here. I don't know about the rest of you. I'll go out of here, my head spinning on it. But to take it all and to focus on one thing. And by the way, today we celebrate the conversion of Paul. Now, there's a guy that thought he had it all together in programs. I mean, he really thought he had it together in programs until he was knocked on his rear end. And then he still couldn't see. Where did he begin to see? Somebody took him by the hand. Somebody else said, Ananias says, come on. You're going to do this. You have the faith. You can be baptized now. I'm sorry, I'm talking too long.
Okay. Thank you, Father Nesti. We've got time for one more question. Go ahead. Did that one die? It was low on battery. Oh, no. Okay. There you go.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your great presentations. I am Ricardo Medina. I'm the Family Life Director here at the diocese. The question, perhaps not for now, but for a follow-up, perhaps conversations, could be if you happen to have some cultural differences on the things you exposed. Here at Houston, we have at least 6 different cultural groups, all of them Catholic, approaching our faith in very different ways. So their understanding of family, marriage, parenting, and so on, they are quite diverse. And I wouldn't dare that any one of them is better than the other. Some things in the Hispanic culture are better. Some things in the agriculture are better. So I think that's a golden opportunity for analyzing those differences we have. And if you happen to have information there, I will be thrilled of following up on that matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Take that. Sure.
Yeah, I grew up Irish Italian and then married Joe. His parents were very different with the expectations, and it took a while. It was something that Joe and I had to kind of deal with. He had kind of gone on and went to a Jesuit high school in El Paso and then on to Loyola University in Tulane. But and so he kind of moved away from some of that. But it was a real struggle for me at first. Their expectations of me and of us as a couple were very much on the more, the bigger, and the better. And when Joe chose to stay in academic medicine and wasn't going to go into private practice and make all this big money, I wasn't going to be part of the social circles that I had no, goal to be, any of that. It was a real challenge. They were not extremely accepting of who we were and having this big family. So it can be a real challenge dealing with some of that. Fortunately, Joe and I, could dialogue, as Father would say. We could talk about it, and I could start to learn where he was coming from sometimes, because it was where he grew up and how, his parents dealt with things very differently than my parents. So, yeah, I do think it's and Father, you may remember there was a conference years ago, and it was the first time I was kind of, if you want to say, made aware of how different cultures did things, because there were the Vietnamese and the Spanish, and even within the Latino, some of us, they didn't like us calling it Hispanic and Latino. And so, yeah, I became aware of that.
And just one more point on the sort of ethnic character of not just Houston, but just the country more generally. For folks here, what would you guess is the national origin for couples who have the most stable marriages in America? Most stable marriages in America, the lowest rates of divorce. What sending country who's sending people from their country to the U.S. would qualify there? The Philippines is pretty good, but they're not number one. Not Nigeria? What? India. She's right. Okay. Now, I only mention that just because what we see in the U.S. is that Asian couples tend to have the highest rates of marital stability, although not necessarily the highest rates of marital quality, which maybe there's some combination there, maybe a recognition or a realism. But I would just mention that also in part because in terms of not only just being culturally sensitive to differences and how they're related to marital stability, marital quality, but also to the kind of intergenerational character, at least historically, of many Asian models. And I think in this newer cultural context where it is, as Father was saying, Robert Bello is telling us that expressive individualism that Bello wrote about has become even more pervasive in this current context. So I think having the benefit, if you can, of kind of living closer to kin, to parents, grandparents, siblings, might be even more important today. In a broader context where there's just not as much support for family life, and where the challenges of being like a young mother with lots of little kids can be more readily navigated, when you have kin. So my wife had twins 14 years ago, and her mother and her father moved down from Northern Virginia to Charlottesville, and that sort of was a lifesaver for us. Anyways, the point being that I think kind of understanding that in this moment, kind of some aspects of that kind of more Asian approach to family life might be helpful for us in navigating the new challenges facing us today.
Thanks. And then JP, I see your hand up.
Yeah, it's a great question about the challenges of different cultural backgrounds. And a big thing I would like to note is we are, as humanity, a lot more similar than we're dissimilar. I don't want to discount the fact that there are real cultural differences between folks. So as a ministry, currently, we talk about having a framework that's applied differently in different churches. So the form is the same, the matter is different. So when we've served in communities where we've got parishes now that have large Vietnamese, Burmese, Hispanic, Caribbean, or Hispanic Central American, as we've worked with churches where there's migrant farm community, where it's entirely a migrant farm church, or on the Northern Plains tribes where there's great poverty up in, let's say the Crow plantation, the Crow reservation. And what we're seeing is being able to work locally to adapt certain differences within the matter. You can still provide, there's still a deep need to be able to know, trust, rely, commit, these core elements of relational dynamics that my co-author, John Van App, has written a lot about and done a lot of research on. So anyways, I just know that's an important thing. And then back to Father's prior point, I do want to say that Pope Francis's Dicastery for Lady, Family, and Life did publish a really great document that was discussed substantially there in the Archdiocese of Houston not too long ago. I was blessed to be able to be part of those conversations on how to talk through the marriage catechumenate and this idea of remote preparation on through a lifetime. That's, as a ministry, that's how we think of serving into into marriage, that this is something that needs to be done long before you think about coupling up, and then continue long after you do so, and helping folks to live in authentic Christian community, to do that well, and to live the virtues of living well, the sacrament.
Thank you, JP. I want to say first, thank you to all of our speakers today. Really appreciate your insight, your research, your wisdom on this. It's been informative and formative for us, and challenging too. And I want to say thank you to all of you. Look, time, as I'm now sort of squarely into middle age, I'm more aware, I think, that time is one of life's most precious gifts, right? We can make more money, we can't make more time. And you have given us your time today. Thank you for that. We're honored by it, and very much grateful for it.